At first light on February 20, 1944, Captain Thomas Harding stood beneath the aluminum belly of his B-17, frost-biting through worn leather gloves. The ground crew at RAF Bissingbourne moved with silent urgency, fueling and arming the flying fortress for another daylight raid into Nazi Germany's heartland. Harding studied the bomb run maps, knowing today's target lay deep inside the Reich, beyond flak corridors that had swallowed entire crews. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Eddie Mills, forced a grin that fooled no one, fingers trembling slightly as he checked engine gauges again. Around them, mechanics loaded .50 caliber belts into waist guns, their brass casings glinting pale beneath the cold English dawn. The fortress, serial number 4231255, carried scars from previous missions, patched aluminum plates like quiet medals no one celebrated aloud. Harding ran a gloved hand across the fuselage, whispering a promise to bring her home, as if the aircraft could listen. When engines roared alive, for right cyclones coughed smoke into the morning sky, shaking the earth beneath their boots. One by one, the bombers lifted from the runway, heavy with explosives, forming up in tight combat boxes above the channel. Inside the cockpit, Harding felt the familiar vibration through the yoke, a living pulse that steadied his fear. They crossed the Dutch coastline under gray overcast, flak bursts already blooming black against the distant horizon. The radio crackled with clipped commands. Formation leaders, adjusting altitude as searchlights probed uselessly through daylight haze. Harding kept the fortress steady, knowing that any break in formation meant isolation, and isolation meant death. Below, rail yards and factories slipped beneath drifting cloud, the industrial spine feeding Hitler's relentless war machine. Suddenly the sky erupted, heavy anti-aircraft fire hammering upward, shrapnel tearing through open air like invisible razors. The bomber shuddered violently as a shell burst off their starboard wing, metal fragments slicing through the outer panel. Warning lights flickered red across the instrument cluster, and Mills shouted over the engine roar about dropping oil pressure. In the waist compartment, Sergeant Cole reported a wounded gunner, blood darkening his oxygen mask and flight jacket. Harding's jaw tightened. Turning back now meant abandoning the formation and risking court-martial, but pressing forward risked annihilation. As German fighters appeared like distant specks climbing fast toward them, Harding realized this mission was about to test the fortress itself.
The first Messerschmitts of Messerschmitt, Bf 109 slashed through the formation, their cannons flashing white against the dull winter sky. Harding held course as tracers streaked past the cockpit glass, each burst close enough to rattle bone and faith alike. A violent jolt rocked the fortress when 20mm shells tore through the nose compartment, shredding wiring and plexiglass. Bombardier Lieutenant Harris slumped over the Norden sight, stunned but alive, blood seeping through a torn wool sleeve. "We stay in formation," Harding ordered calmly. Though the interphone carried the strain, he refused to show. Another fighter dove from above, stitching fire across their port wing, puncturing a fuel tank already weakened by flak. The cockpit filled with the acrid stench of leaking gasoline, a single spark away from turning them into falling fire. Mills feathered the damaged engine as its APMs faltered, propeller blades slowing against brutal wind resistance. Behind them, a sister B-17 exploded midair, fragments scattering like burning leaves over the cloud deck below. The sight froze the crew for a heartbeat, then training forced them back to their guns and instruments. Sergeant Cole, despite the wounded gunner at his feet, fired steady bursts from the waist position, tracking a passing fighter. The fortress shuddered again as bullets ripped through the tail, severing hydraulic lines controlling the rudder. Harding felt the controls grow sluggish, the aircraft resisting every correction like a wounded animal fighting touch. Above the chaos, contrails streaked high and silver long-range, escorts finally arriving from the direction of the channel. The sleek shapes of P-51 Mustang fighters dove toward the German attackers, guns blazing in protective fury. For a fleeting moment, relief rippled through the battered crew as enemy aircraft peeled away, under fresh assault. But relief vanished when Mills reported they were losing altitude. Engine 3 coughing black smoke into slipstream. The bomb bay doors refused to respond, jammed by shrapnel, leaving thousands of pounds of explosives trapped beneath them. Harding faced a brutal choice: cling to formation and risk stalling, or break away alone over the Reich. As the fortress sagged below its squadron, slipping from the protective box, Harding pushed the throttles forward, daring gravity to take them. The fortress dropped clear of the formation, alone above northern Germany, its silver wings scarred and trailing smoke into the winter sky. Harding felt the weight of isolation immediately. The comforting grid of bombers replaced by vast, indifferent clouds. Engine 3 coughed violently, then failed outright, its propeller windmilling uselessly against freezing air. Mills feathered it fully, but the asymmetric drag pulled the aircraft stubbornly to starboard. With the bomb bay doors jammed, they carried their deadly cargo like a chained anchor. Harding ordered the crew to prepare for a manual emergency release, knowing the procedure meant crawling into exposed mechanisms. Sergeant Cole volunteered without hesitation, stepping over the wounded gunner and clipping his parachute tight. Inside the narrow catwalk above the bombs, Cole felt the icy slipstream seeping through torn fuselage skin. Another wave of German fighters circled back, noticing the crippled bomber falling behind the main formation. A pair of Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters rolled into attack position, their radial engines growling like predators. Tracer fire stitched across the fortress again, punching fresh holes through already weakened aluminum ribs. The tail gunner shouted that his controls were sluggish, hydraulics nearly gone from earlier damage. Harding wrestled the yoke gently, careful not to overstress the battered airframe. Beneath them, fields and frozen rivers of the German countryside drifted closer as altitude bled away. In the bomb bay, Cole reached the manual crank, hands trembling as flak bursts rocked the aircraft. He began turning, metal grinding against warped tracks, each rotation agonizingly slow. A cannon round tore through the belly, exploding near the rear bulkhead and showering sparks across the bombs. For a terrifying second, the crew believed the fortress would ignite from within, but the explosives held firm, and with a final wrenching effort, the bomb bay doors cracked open to rushing air. As the first bombs tumbled free toward the earth below, another fighter lined up directly behind them, guns flashing bright.
The last bombs tore free at once, the sudden lift jolting the fortress upward as if released from a drowning grip. Harding seized the moment, trimming the controls carefully, while the aircraft clawed back a few precious 100 feet. The pursuing fighter overshot in the confusion, its tracers slicing empty air where the bomber had sagged seconds earlier. But the sky offered no mercy. Another Messerschmitt Bf-109 curved in from below, angling for their exposed belly. Sergeant Cole scrambled back to his waist gun, boots slipping on hydraulic fluid pooled across the floor. He fired in short, disciplined bursts, the .50 caliber recoil, hammering his shoulder as brass casings bounced wildly. One burst struck home, shattering the fighter's canopy and sending it spiraling downward in a trail of smoke. The crew barely had time to register the kill before another cannon round slammed into the nose. Shards of plexiglass and metal ripped through the bombardier's station, cutting deeper into Lieutenant Harris's wounded arm. Mills shouted that fuel levels were dropping fast, the ruptured tank bleeding precious gallons into open air. Harding calculated silently. Even with lighter weight, they were too deep inside Germany to limp home easily. The radio operator tried raising any nearby formation, but static swallowed his calls across the cold sky. Alone and battered, the fortress drifted westward, engines straining unevenly against mounting headwinds. In the tail, the gunner reported another problem. The elevator controls felt dangerously loose and unresponsive. Harding tested the yoke gently, feeling a disturbing slack before the nose obeyed. If the control cables snapped entirely, the aircraft would plunge without warning. Below, scattered villages dotted the countryside, church steeples piercing pale winter haze. For a fleeting moment, Harding wondered about the families beneath them, unaware of the duel raging overhead. A final pair of German fighters hovered at distance, perhaps low on fuel, perhaps waiting for the bomber to fail. As Engine 2 sputtered unexpectedly, coughing a sharp burst of flame, Harding realized survival now depended on something beyond training alone. Engine 2's flame died as quickly as it appeared, but the vibration that followed shook the fortress to its bones. Mills throttled it back cautiously, fearing detonation, while all pressure needles trembled near fatal red lines. Harding weighed shutting the engine down entirely, knowing to dead engines meant a slow, helpless descent. Behind them, the distant shapes of German fighters faded, either satisfied or forced home by fuel limits. For the first time since crossing the Dutch coast, the sky around them fell eerily empty. Silence settled inside the fuselage, except for uneven engine roar and the labored breathing of wounded men. Lieutenant Harris insisted he could still navigate, cradling his injured arm while tracing their course westward. The radio operator finally caught a faint transmission from a returning bomber group, scattered by flak. They reported heavy losses over central Germany and worsening weather moving in from the North Sea. Harding glanced ahead and saw the truth forming. thick cloud banks rising like a grey wall between them and England. With limited fuel and crippled controls, climbing above the weather was no longer an option. Ice began forming along the leading edges of their wings, subtle at first, then thickening with dangerous weight. Mills activated dicing boots, rubber membranes inflating and cracking thin layers from the metal skin. The fortress responded sluggishly, as though exhausted from absorbing punishment meant to tear it apart. In the waist compartment, Cole bandaged the wounded gunner tighter, whispering steady reassurances over engine thunder. The crew had stopped speaking about medals or missions. Now they spoke only of home and warm kitchens. Harding calculated fuel consumption again. Realizing even a direct course might leave them short of the channel, he considered diverting toward a friendly airfield in the Netherlands. Recently liberated but still contested, yet shifting course meant more time over enemy territory, where flak batteries still waited unseen below. As the fortress entered the towering cloud wall, vanishing into cold white darkness, Harding knew the next threat would be invisible and merciless.